welcome to enter the webinar room. Thanks very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Suri Moon. I am the co-director of the Global Health Center here at the Graduate Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us for the launch of our report today, Rising Pharmaceutical Innovation in the Global South, Painting with New Colors. In just a moment, I will explain why this is the title of the report. But first, I wanted to welcome and thank all of you for joining us, including those of you who are joining online. I also wanted to let you know that we are recording this session, and the recording will be made available in full after today's event. And I also wanted to especially thank our partners, which includes BRAC University's James P. Grant School of Public Health. Our colleagues are online joining us very late at night from Dhaka, and also our colleagues at Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, where our colleagues are joining us fairly early in the morning. And of course, Open Society Foundations. This project was made possible as a collaboration by a project of the Open Society Foundations called the Open Society University Network. Maybe a few words of background on the project before we dive in. I think many of you are aware that research and development in the Global South is a topic that has been on the policy agenda, certainly here in the health community in Geneva for many years, for the last 10 to 20 years, but it has especially become a topic of interest because, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic and because of the inequities in access to health technologies that we all witnessed during that pandemic. And so it is highly relevant to ongoing policy debates, for example, in the ongoing discussions for a pandemic instrument, where it is currently research and development is the subject of one of the articles in the Zero Draft. And this is one of the reasons why we're particularly delighted to have 3 members of the Geneva policy community here to comment on the report's findings. I'll introduce them in more depth when it's their turn to speak. But we have, of course, Matthias Helbel from the World Health Organization. We have Mohammed Kamruzaman from the Bangladesh Mission. And we have, joining us online, Maria Juliana Tenorio Quintero from the Colombian Mission. And I think it's very important for us that we try to make these links between academic research and some of the policy debates happening here. As I mentioned, this is a topic that has long been of policy interest. It's also long been of interest to us as academic researchers. And the Open Society University Network collaboration really provided us an important opportunity to dive further into the topic of R&D in the Global South. This is part of a broader project called the New Business Models of Pharmaceutical Innovation, which is a project supported by the Swiss National Science Foundation that is now in its 5th year, for which I'm the principal investigator. We have a number of the project team members here. And within this project, what we're asking is, can research and development be organized differently? Can it be financed and incentivized and regulated differently so that we have better outcomes for global public health? And what we mean by better outcomes is that we have unmet medical needs being addressed, so that missing innovation is actually addressed. And what we mean is that the fruits of that innovation are affordable and available and accessible to everybody worldwide. Now, this is the big question that we are asking. And one of the sub-questions that has come up is, are there different business models emerging in the Global South? Are there different approaches to pharmaceutical innovation that we should be aware of? What we realized as we began looking at this question was there's very little systematic information about any kind of R&D happening in the Global South. There's, of course, some literature, there's a number of case studies, but when we looked for kind of a centralized, comprehensive report, what is happening? Who is doing R&D? What have been the results? How has this changed over the last 10 or 20 years? We were surprised, actually, at what little we found. There was no single report that really brought all of this together. There were also a number of country case studies, but focusing on a relatively small number of countries, and we thought this was also an excellent opportunity to contribute to the knowledge base by looking not only at the global level, but also at 2 important countries, of course, Bangladesh and Colombia. And so I'm really delighted that after, I don't know how many months now, 18, 20 months of research, we are able to share with you our results. And I will be the first to say I've been surprised at a number of the findings. I learned a lot of things that I did not expect to learn when we began on this journey. So I hope that you'll also find the results of interest and of relevance to your work. And before I give the floor over to Marcela Vieira and Ichi Liu, who are our lead researchers on this project, I would just like to explain the title. So you can already see, spoiler alert, from the title that one of the findings is indeed that there is rising innovative activity in the Global South. You can, of course, deduce that from the title. But the reason why we gave the report a subtitle of painting is because there is no single unified data source where we could find information. So what we ended up doing was triangulating. We pulled together information from a number of different sources. I'll let my colleagues explain a little bit more detail what that is. And what we're beginning to see is an emerging picture, a painting that might be a bit impressionistic at first, but I think the contours of that painting are becoming clearer and clearer. And the reason why we said we're painting with new colors is because we find that some of the outcomes are perhaps not what many people assume about what is happening in terms of pharmaceutical innovation in the Global South. So, without further ado, let me just take you quickly through the program, and then we'll launch into our very first presentation. So we'll begin by taking a look at the global level, share with you the outcome of our mapping exercise. Marcela and Ichi will present the report. Then we'll have comments from two experts who will be looking at this, again, from the global level. Carlos Correa from the South Center, who will be joining us online, and Matthias Hubble, who is happily sitting right next to me. That'll take us through the first hour. Then we'll turn to our case study of Bangladesh, and we'll have a presentation by Nahitun Natter and Sanjida Ahmed Shrishti from our team based in Dhaka, and then we'll have comments from our colleague from the Bangladesh mission, Mr. Kamruzaman. Then we'll turn in the last segment to our colleagues from Colombia. Professor Tatiana Andia will be joining us, is joining us, I'm already online, from Bogota, and then we'll have comments, as I mentioned before, from Maria Juliana Quintero. All of this, I hope, will take us to about 4:30, so we'll be running about 2.5 hours total, after which we invite you to join us for a reception afterwards. After each chunk of time, if we're on time, I hope we'll have space for Q&A. Comments and questions from the floor, but my job is to keep us moving, and more or less, roughly, on time. So without further ado, let's give the floor to my colleagues. I'm really delighted. Marcela Vieira has been working on these issues for many years, for about 18, maybe 19 years now. She is a senior researcher on our new business models team. And Ichi Liu is a recent graduate of the Graduate Institute in International Relations and Political Science, and a former research assistant, also with the New Business Models team. Over to you.
Okay, so yeah, maybe we should put the microphone here. So thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us today. Good afternoon for those of you here in Geneva. Good morning, good night, depending on where you are joining us from online. Thank you for being with us today. So I'm going to be presenting the reports from the Global Health Center as part of this research collaboration, Rising Pharmaceutical Innovation in the Global South, Painting with New Colors, where we explore more generally pharmaceutical activities in low and middle income countries. I'm going to be presenting together with my colleague Ichi Liu, that's sitting just next to me, but I also want to thank the co-authors of the report, Aziza Siddiqui. I apologize for never learning how to pronounce your last name. Hopefully you're joining us online from the US. Luis, Caitlin Large, and Suni Moon, who are here with all of us today. So, as Suni mentioned, the context for this project was due to the fact that we have been conducting lots of research in pharmaceutical innovation in the past years for the New Business Model project, but we have seen that most of the information is actually refers to either the United States or a few Western European countries, and there is scarce information on existing activities, capacities, and outcomes of pharmaceutical innovation in low and middle-income countries. So we decided to have a special arm of the project actually dedicating, compiling, mapping, and analyzing information specifically to those countries. So basically, the report has mainly two objectives. The first one is to provide a baseline picture of pharmaceutical innovation in low and middle-income countries. And the second one is to identify possible alternative R&D models being implemented in LMICs. And to do that, we had a fourfold methodology. First, we conducted a literature review, really focusing in low and middle-income countries. Then we conducted scoping interviews with experts in pharmaceutical R&D globally, but also particularly in the Global South. And I'd like to thank some of people that were interviewed that are here in the room today. We conducted 8 scoping interviews. Then we did a database analysis from the information that we could find, pulling from different sources. And finally, we did a mapping of innovative proposals of R&D based on the process of the CWG and WHO, which I'll go into more details soon. So I combined the findings from the literature review and the scoping interview into different teams. And one thing that we could identify mostly from the literature review is that there is growing activity in pharmaceutical innovation in developing countries, but most of these studies that we were able to find refer only to a few LMICs, particularly China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and Cuba. During the scoping interviews, there were a number of other countries that were mentioned as having important and rising activities in pharmaceutical innovation, and I invite you to have a look at the full research report for more information about that. The literature also identified some of the innovation pathways that have been followed by countries to develop their pharmaceutical innovation systems, and the most talked about pathway was what was called imitation to innovation, in which countries start by copying generic drugs of existing products, then going to some incremental innovation from those for those products before they actually start conducting more innovative R&D activities. And funding from for R&D came mostly from the production and sale of generic drugs and for providing research services that led both to revenues that could then be used for R&D and also to cumulative innovation capacity in a number of countries. But it was also raised that currently there is reduced policy space to follow that pathway, mostly due to international agreements that restrict access to information, knowledge, and technology. So that path has been reduced, but still, the path that's followed by most countries in the Global South. So then there was a special focus in the role of governments in actually supporting and funding pharmaceutical R&D in a number of developing countries, particularly upper middle income countries, especially given the limited private capital that's available to do that. So we've seen significant government support, not only from fundings, but also a number of other policies that have been adopted with indirect funding or incentives, and also a number of governments that have their own research institutes or their own pharmaceutical companies and laboratories that are important part of this process. And also philanthropic funding and development assistance aid was raised as being particular important source of funding, in particular in countries from Southern Africa. In terms of R&D policies, there are a few that were worth highlighting. And countries like Brazil and Thailand, for instance, they were mentioned for adopting policies that link R&D capacity with technological and industrial development, and also with public health needs. Other countries like China and Russia were specifically mentioned for having policies of mandatory local manufacturing for not only pharmaceuticals, but for a number of other sectors, and that has also led to cumulative capacity for innovation. Many countries have adopted a policy of mandatory clinical trials to be conducted domestically to be able to obtain regulatory approval in that country. So that has led to an increase in the capacity to conduct clinical trials in those countries. But it has also been raised that many countries do not have specific R&D policies, and this has been a low political priority for governments, especially beyond upper middle-income countries. Then the literature also talked about a number of actors that are involved in pharmaceutical R&D, and the interviews also highlighted the important role of academic institutions and of small and middle-sized enterprises that are especially involved in earlier phases of the process. But it has been raised as an important gap in translational research, as most countries do not have the infrastructure of intermediaries that can actually take basic and early stage research happening in academia to actually the end of the product development. And another topic that came out was international collaboration, that showing that a number of projects for product development in developing countries actually happen in partnership with organizations from abroad. In terms of the R&D priorities, it was really highlighted that addressing local needs and improving ease of care, ease of use, is really a way of setting priorities in a number of developing countries. But there is a risk that especially the private sector might not address diseases mostly affecting poor market segments, even in developing countries. So there is a need to develop specific public policies to address those needs. Then a number of challenges and barriers were also identified in the literature and in the interviews, basically discussing the lack of financial and human resources, lack of research infrastructure, especially some special types of laboratories that are needed to conduct some of the clinical trials, the lack of targeted policies directed to pharmaceutical R&D, some regulatory issues around clinical trials, and also the approval of medicines in some countries, and limited pharmacovigilance was some of the challenges that was mostly raised. But then we also saw a number of studies, and this was raised by a number of the interviewers as well, with some of the outputs that we can see from all of these investments and all of this growing capacity that's coming from developing countries. And we have put together a table with examples of pharmaceutical products developed in low and middle income countries. So we were able to identify, and this is only from the literature review and the scoping interviews. We didn't do a dedicated search for products, so this list is probably much longer. But we have put together 23 products that were developed by organizations based in 7 low and middle income countries, particularly Brazil, China, Cuba, Egypt, and Malaysia, in collaboration, India, and Russia. These products was basically small molecule drugs, but also biologics and vaccines, plant-based medicines, diagnostics platforms, monoclonal antibodies, and gene therapies as well. They are used to treat several diseases, including neglected tropical diseases, infectious diseases, HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, meningitis, viral hepatitis, diabetes, antibiotics, and cancer, so a wide range of diseases. And they were developed by private companies, public and private universities, public research centers, and state-owned institutions, as well as in collaboration with some global initiatives as the PDPs based here in Geneva. So now I'll give the floor to my colleague, who is going to walk us through the findings from the database analysis that we did.
Thank you very much, Marcella, and thank you, Suri, for the introduction. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I will be presenting the findings of our database analysis. So to complement the findings from interviews and scoping interviews and literature review, we also conducted analysis on publicly available data listed on the WHO Global Observatory on Health and Research Development, including the data from the World Report, GFinder, and from the WHO International Clinical Trial Registry platform. So to understand activities happening in low and middle income countries, we selected 3 indicators, including funding flows, health research capacity, and clinical trials. So for the clinical trial analysis, we used a curated database from a study by Laura Merson and others, which cleaned data from the WHO ICTRP database. We then added our additional information on health categories and phases, and then created a unique data set for our analysis. So this supplementary data is also published online. So to understand the funding flows and R&D capacities, we synthesized data on, We synthesized data on the WHO Global Observatory, and we particularly look at the gross domestic R&D expenditure on health and medical sciences, which is referred to as health GERD. And we found that South Africa, Kenya, and Mozambique were the countries with highest percentage of GDP invested in health GRD in their respective income groups. And in terms of the number of research, we found that Bulgaria had the highest number of health researchers per million inhabitants among upper middle income countries, while Egypt had the highest number of health researchers among lower middle income countries. And there was no low income countries among the top 10 low and middle income countries with the highest number of health researchers. Then we also look at the R&D funding tracked by the World Report, which is an open access database managed by the United States National Institute of Health. And we look at the low and middle income countries with the highest number of research grants for biomedical research. And our funding found that South Africa had the highest number, followed by China and Kenya. And among the low and middle income countries with the highest number of research organizations receiving grants, we found that China, South Africa, and Brazil were the highest, were the countries with the highest number among upper middle income countries, and India and Kenya are countries among lower middle income countries, and Uganda and Malawi had the highest number among lower income countries. Then we also had a look at the data tracking R&D funding for diseases that disproportionately affect the world's most disadvantaged population, which was managed by GFinder. And then in that, from this analysis, we found that from 2010 to 2020, there was an increase of more than 450% in the total amount funded by middle-income countries, while funding from low-income countries remained roughly the same. And among low and middle-income countries, the most significant public funder was India, while the top receiving countries were India and South Africa. Then we did a relatively more detailed analysis of the clinical trial activities happening in low and middle income countries, as well as high income countries, to have an overall picture. And so clinical trial activities are a very important part of the process for pharmaceuticals. We looked at the main purpose of this analysis was to identify what are the low and middle countries that are most active in conducting and or hosting clinical trials. We first look at the number of trials. We found that, so we used data from 1990 to 2020, to December of 2020. So although the most earliest available data was from 1990, you can see from this graph, more data became available only after 1998 and in early 2000. And we were able to find that during this period of time, 80% of the clinical trials were conducted in high-income countries, and only about 20% were conducted in low and middle-income countries. But then there was also an increased share from low and middle-income countries. So in 2000, low and middle-income countries' share was only 5%, and in 2020, their share has increased to about 30%. And we also observed that from 2010 to 2020, the number of trials in low and middle income countries increased by 375%, which is quite significant. We also identified the top 20 low and middle income countries in terms of the numbers of clinical trials that happened in their countries. And China, India, and Iran were the top 3 countries conducting clinical trials during this period of time. We were also interested in the phases of these clinical trials. So clinical trials were generally categorized into 4 phases, and the earlier phases usually involve more innovative research and are more risky, while the later phases, for example, phase 3 trials, are conducted with a large population, and is usually the step right before the market approval of the product. So we were able to find that the largest number of trials were in phase 3 in both high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. And most of the top 20 low and middle-income countries had a relatively larger number of phase 2 and phase 3 trials. However, we also found that China had a significant share of phase 0 and phase 1 trials, and India had a significant share of phase 1 trial. There was also a significant increase in phase 0 trial in low and middle income countries from 2010 to 2020, and especially Egypt and Thailand, which showed significant growth in earlier stages of R&D. And from these results, we were able to conclude that there are growing trends that indicate growing capacity in the riskier and more innovative earlier stages of R&D in low and middle income countries. We also looked at the types of disease that these clinical trials were for, and the largest number of trials were for malignant neoplasm, which is cancer in both high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. And infectious and parasitic disease represent only about 5% of trials in high-income countries and about 9% in low and middle-income countries. There was also a significant increase in trials for respiratory disease in all of the countries, and especially in for low and middle income countries, there was also an increase for non-communicable disease and congenital anomalies. Finally, we look at the type of sponsors and funders for these trials. So in the study by Laura Merson in 2022, they categorized the sponsors and funders into commercial versus non-commercial. So commercial funders is defined as organizations with a profit-driven structure or a company structure, and non-commercial was categorized as organizations with no profit-driven status identified, including public health research institutions, hospitals, and some other non-profit research organizations. And we were able to find that in both high-income countries and low and middle-income countries, there was a higher number of non-commercial sponsors of clinical trials, and in low and middle-income countries, there was a higher number of non-commercial funders as well. So we would like to also draw attention to the roles of non-commercial actors from this analysis. We observed an increasing involvement of non-commercial sponsors and funders over the past years, particularly in the earlier R&D phases. And non-commercial actors play a markedly dominant role in some of the disease areas, such as maternal conditions, sexual health, perinatal conditions, and nutritional deficiency. So with these, I would like to stop here, and these were some of the findings from the database analysis, and I invite you to look into the section of the report for a more detailed analysis. So let's keep back the floor to Michelle to present the conclusion and other findings.
Thank you so much, Ichi. So coming back to the second objective of the report, which was to map existing innovative or alternative models of R&D happening in countries from the global south. We could not find that database. We've been trying to build a database of alternative models for some years now, and it has not been easy exercise. So we could not really find a centralized database for that, and we decided to look at the proposals that were submitted to an open call that was opening to 2013 by WHO, following the process of the consultative expert working group on research and development, which was an open call that was open to anyone that was interested in presenting alternative ways of conducting R&D, especially dedicated to diseases that disproportionately affect low and middle income countries. And from that mapping, we could find that were 106 project proposals that was submitted by for this call, and we were able to retrieve information only for 52 out of those 106. And most of the proposals were submitted by governments, public research institutes, and universities. And we identified 34 proposals that were presented by organizations from 23 low and middle income countries, which you can see in Table 9 list of the organizations that submitted these proposals, classified by regions, so the countries actually where the organizations are based. And we have an appendix in the full report where you can find more information with the full list of the proposals submitted by the organizations based in LMICs. What we would like to highlight from this mapping is, again, the important role of non-commercial actors, which indicate at least a willingness to take alternative approaches to R&D and low and middle income countries. So now, finally, coming to the conclusions of the report, as we mentioned before, and Suri mentioned as well, we have been conducting research in this area for some time now, and have not been able to find much detailed information about low and middle income countries. And despite the limitations of the data that we were able to find, some of the databases are very limited in terms of disease scope or in the number of funders that are included in the databases. So the data is still very limited. There is still a need for more data than that. But we were able, by triangulating with the literature review, the scoping interviews, and the database analysis, we're able to paint a broad picture of who was involved in pharmaceutical R&D in low and middle income countries, in which particular countries activities are more active, and for which disease types, and also in which phases of R&D and with what results, as well as changing over time, especially in the last decade. You see in the bottom of the screen a list of the top 16 LMICs involved in pharmaceutical innovation that was combining the different sources that we used for reports. And what we have seen is that there has been growing investment in research and development, particularly from middle-income countries. And there is also growing capacity to conduct biomedical research, as indicated by the increase in the number of research organizations and the amount of funding received by those organizations. We also see a growing number of clinical trials, especially of special relevance, including in the earlier, more innovative and riskier phases of the process. And we have seen a very significant and growing role of non-commercial funders and sponsors of clinical trials. And lastly, we believe that this high number of non-commercial actors, it suggests that at least fertile soil for alternative R&D models exists in low and middle income countries that are not driven primarily by market incentives, and hopefully can lead to better global public health outcomes as well. So I thank you all for your attention. This is the link for the knowledge portal on innovation and access to medicines, where you can find the full research report, and we're going to be uploading the report from this event soon as well. So thank you so much.
So much for summarizing a 60-page report in 23 minutes. Let me see if Professor Carlos Correa is online. He did tell us he might be delayed, so it looks like that's the case. In which case, I'll turn directly to you, Matthias, for your comments on the report. Dr. Matthias Hebel is a scientist in the Research for Health Department at the World Health Organization. He studied health economics. He has a PhD from our very own Graduate Institute and the Smith School of Public Health. He's worked for a number of intergovernmental organizations. And one of his core responsibilities is supporting WHO member states in strengthening their research and development capacity. So we can imagine a few more appropriate speakers than you, Matthias, to comment on this. And I will stand up once you approach the 7-minute mark.
Thanks so much, Suri, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. It's nice to come back to the Graduate Institute, and especially for this occasion. This is a very solid report, and it was a real pleasure to go through it, to read it. And first of all, congratulations to the authors. I think it's a very important piece of research that you have published today. So first of all, my overall comments are, as I said, a very valuable report. It has a lot of new and interesting findings, and it's also coming out at a very important moment. It's a very critical juncture that we're currently at WHO especially. And why is that? Because a lot of low and middle income countries, as well as the international community, that aim to enhance the local manufacturing capacity. And so this is an important piece of evidence that feeds into the current discussions. I thought I'd put together my 3 highlights of the report. The first one is you nicely show and paint, may say, the various innovation pathways that lead to successful local manufacturing production. And I think it's nice to see the experience of countries like India or China or Cuba, how they were able to basically become important international players in pharmaceutical production. Another important highlight for me was that you observe this increase in earlier stages of R&D in LMICs, because that's not so obvious, because we always think that a lot of, especially in the earlier stages of the R&D, is taking place in high-income countries. But you find that increasingly we also find it in low middle-income countries, and not only 1 or 2, but it's really a broad movement, which is very positive, I think. And the last point I think is also important to mention is that we see more and more non-commercial funders in this area of R&D funding, which again shows that luckily it's not only driven by the private sector, but we see that a lot of governments also have an increased understanding of the importance of R&D for local, regional, and global health. Today I will quickly focus on the role of governments, because at WHO our main constituencies are governments. When it comes to R&D, questions, of course, what governments can and what governments should do. And of course, we're now coming to the end of the pandemic, and we have seen a huge global inequity in access to all kinds of health products to fight the pandemic. And there is an increased understanding that we need to restructure the global manufacturing capacity, not only when it comes to vaccines, but also to other health products. We have these 3 stages when it comes to producing health technologies. We have this R&D stage, manufacturing, and delivery. And a lot of efforts and focus are currently on this middle stage about local manufacturing. We have a program at WHO since actually a couple of years that focuses on tech transfer. We also have people working on pre-qualification and regulatory strengthening, and also training workforce. But of course, we need a whole ecosystem, and that of course also includes the R&D stage. And just to give you a little bit the context that we're in at WHO, we're seeing a lot of efforts now by member states to build and to strengthen domestic and regional manufacturing capacity. And there's a lot of support by the international donor community, also a lot of multilateral development banks are becoming active to finance the expansion of local manufacturing capacity. And we have also seen major WHO initiatives emerging in the last couple of years. However, we think that it's not enough to just focus on manufacturing. We also need a really effective and equity-oriented domestic R&D system to make this local production of new health technology sustainable. And that's especially important for inter-pandemic times, because when we establish an mRNA technology-based hub, then we also need to make sure that these plants are kept warm between pandemics. So we have started at WHO to develop a framework on strengthening national R&D systems, and this report very nicely feeds into this effort. So the overall objective is to support the development of domestic R&D systems to make this local production sustainable, to be able to adapt these technologies to local needs, and also to, of course, ultimately improve access to health technologies. And the last 2-3 minutes, if I may have, I will just explain a bit what we would like to include in this framework. So this framework is supposed to give every government the opportunity to tailor its policies to its needs. And I have listed here a couple of dimensions of this framework. The first one is, of course, to set the priorities in terms of R&D, because, of course, resources are very thin, and we need to invest them in the right product or in the appropriate technology. So this could mean that maybe, as you also mentioned in the report, countries focus on, let's say, diagnostics or devices. They don't need to work necessarily with the latest mRNA technology. Then what's also important, and you also allude to this in the report, is about the institutional structure. So this is about which models governments apply to the R&D sector. Should they work with this public-private partnership model like the PDPs? What kind of IP regime is in place? What are the existing flexibilities that can be used? And of course, it's about financing of R&D. And again, we have pull and push mechanisms that you very well know probably. And we need to find, I think, the right mix and see what's possible within the specific country context. Then, of course, the development of skills is very important. And then we also think that it's important that countries are able to integrate into regional and international R&D networks, because a lot of these efforts in the R&D space are only possible if researchers work together across borders. Then it's important to think early on about access and also interoperability, to make sure that the R&D outcomes can be also produced locally or at least regionally. So we need to make sure that there's also a certain manufacturing capacity available. And of course, we need coherence between other policies within and also outside the health sector. Maybe I'll leave it with this for a moment. And thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Matthias, and for me at least, it's the first time I've seen this framework presented, so very exciting to have this view of what WHO is working on strengthening domestic R&D capacity. I don't think we have Dr. Correa online yet, which means that I'm going to steal about 10 minutes for any comments, Q&A on the global report before we shift gears in just a moment to look at the country level report from Bangladesh and Colombia. So any questions or comments for our research team? Yes, please. And please introduce yourself before you.
Yeah, I don't know how to introduce myself.
Your name?
I am someone who always asks silly questions. My name is Boris Engelson. I'm a local journalist freelance. While you were talking, I checked online and I realized that in each and every country on earth, each year, there are scores of fairs congresses, etc., on pharma, vaccines, etc. And there are federations of pharmaceutical industry in Colombia, in Algeria, in Pakistan. Maybe I was at Pinterest finding something for Bhutan. So do we live in the same world? Because you said that there is scarce information on what's on either side in terms of research and pharma, etc. But you can just pop into any of these fairs and you will find hundreds of actors of even the most remote country. So that would be my first question. Are all these sources irrelevant to you? Another one is the increasing number of non-profit actors in that field of good or bad omen, because it can be interpreted as, oh, how so many people are willing to engage in public health for the good of the people, or it could be a sign that there is availability of fundings and fashions and trends to take available. Or this would be my first two silly questions.
Thank you. Excellent question. Let me just see if there are any others. Yes, please.
Hi, Yves Messi here. I'm on the business technology side of things, and I was very interested in your comments on the state of intellectual property in this space, especially in lower middle income countries. So could you comment on the current state of maturity of IP frameworks when it comes to lower middle class countries, and where this would go to facilitate these goals that you've set forward in the framework? Thank you.
I think it's a related question to that one. I'm a student here. It's going to be a silly, selfish question. I'm sorry, but I'm writing my thesis a little bit on this. And you just commented on some of the international agreements hindering a little bit of production, like the local manufacturing in some countries in the global south. I wanted to know if there are some items specifically, for example, intellectual property or public procurement, that are like being especially affected by these agreements. Yeah, that'll be my question.
Okay. So do you want to take the first stab?
Say something? Apologies, some people mentioned that the volume of the microphone is a bit low, so I'm going to try to speak closer to the microphone. So thank you for your questions. I think what we meant to say by this scarce information about the topic is that the fairs that you mentioned, of course, there's lots of congresses happening, but you really have to go like at the country level and try to put this information together. And most of the time they are not, the full content is not available. So you can have access like to the programs, but you can't really have access to what was presented. And then there has been this effort of building a centralized database mostly, which is currently now the WHO Global Observatory on Research and Development, exactly to try to address that need of having a more centralized database and also information that's presented in a way that can be compared across countries. So there's lots happening. You're right about that, but it's really scarce, and you really have to go digging country by country if you want to have like a broad picture. It's a research effort that hopefully we helped bringing a step towards having more centralized information on what's happening. But yeah, there's much more happening beyond that as well, but we try to use as most as possible centralized databases that provided indicators in a way that can be compared across countries. Your other question about non-commercial actors involved, that's something that we have been exploring more in your broad, the umbrella research project, as Suri mentioned in her introductory remarks. It's a 5 years research project that is coming through to that this year, where we'll be really looking more in depth into alternative models, not only not for profit, but also small and middle-sized enterprises that might be for profit, but working in in a different way. And really what we call alternative ways of conducting it is that it's not with the main objective. In the end of the day, the main objective is not to make as much profit as you can, which is usually for-profit companies, especially multinational pharmaceutical companies. That's their main goal while developing products. So we see, and as we have seen by the analysis of the disease areas, that most of the non-commercial actors are involved in clinical trials. Several of them are actually diseases that are identified as having less commercial interest or less markets, but and usually there's less products developed for the treatment of these diseases. So we can see that the commercial sector is involved mostly. The non-commercial actors are involved mostly with the development of diseases where there is not enough marketing incentives, so they are left unattended. But we have also seen a number of non-commercial actors in cancer research, for instance, which some of it can have high profits as well. So it's a mix, but what we are seeing is that usually diseases that there is not enough market incentives are left unattended, and hopefully non-commercial players can come to fill that role. And also a problem of affordability, as most of the products that are developed by for-profit organizations, they are priced very high. And usually we see countries of all income levels actually struggling to provide access to their population, for those medications. But I invite you to keep an eye out for the findings of our broader project on alternative business models for more about that question. The other question from, I think I'll take your question first because I remember that better. Well, in this report, we didn't go so much into details about the international agreements, but there are some of the studies that we identified in the literature. They talked a lot, mostly about the TRIPS agreements, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property of the World Trade Organization, and how that has impacted the ability of countries also to learn by doing. This invitation to innovation pathway that was discussed a bit in the report. Mainly by giving ownership of the knowledge that is necessary to produce medicines, making that be proprietary instead of being open for others to be able to freely copy, to learn from that, to improve from that, to produce. So most of the discussions are around the TRIPS agreements and intellectual property rights. But I would say that other types of regulations, they didn't come up so much into our discussion. It was mostly focused on the intellectual property aspects of things. We also have three recent research reports analyzing pharmaceutical innovation as global public goods, where we go a bit more into detail on how that could be done. So I invite you also to look at our portal, knowledge portal on innovation and access to medicines, for that research about pharmaceutical innovation as global public goods. And we also have other reports about more commercial pharmaceutical innovation as well in the website. And I'm sorry, but I forgot.
Because one of the good things that I learned from the report is that more grassroots or lower middle income R&D of the phase 0 first one would be useful. How are IP frameworks today supporting this, or are they supporting it, and where could they move to improve that?
We haven't really done a detailed analysis of that. This was really like just a first step of a mapping of where activities was going is taking place. We didn't really go and analyze the specific regulations of each individual country. So I'm sorry to disappoint you that you're not going to find like in-depth detailed information in the report about that, but there are some indications in the literature as well, particularly, and we're going to hear more about that from our partners in Bangladesh as well, because Bangladesh still does not have to apply the patent protection for pharmaceuticals, so they're seeing how that has led to the development of their pharmaceutical system, and also in preparation for when they do have to adopt those provisions of the TRIPS agreement. So we're going to hear more about that from our colleagues in Bangladesh in a minute. But yeah, I invite you to look at the literature section of the report for some. There are some discussions about how the framework can, the IP framework mostly can hinder this capacity of innovating. That's the mainstream of the literature says that it has put additional obstacles and that there is a need to make better use of the flexibilities that are existing within the international framework, as well as Matthias raised in his presentation. And there's also other studies that mention that it can be important to have more intellectual property protection, sometimes for the development of local capacities, especially when you start having more innovative R&D coming from the private sector in low and middle income countries. Some of them try to adjust to protect more the local innovation by giving more intellectual property protection. So there is like these two sides of the discussions in the literature.
The only reason why I ask is because at the EU level, there's the EU IPO, for example, the Intellectual Property Office has a framework and technology to facilitate government-to-government sharing, which I've architected and built. So for the African Union perspective, maybe there could be an encouragement of sharing that IP using digital platforms to then have IP that's transferable and trackable. So I was just brainstorming, and that's the main reason why I asked. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. Really fantastic questions. Anything you'd like to add? Okay. We are actually right on time. So I'm going to shift us to the next part of the program. I'd like to ask Dr. Naidin Nahara. She's here with us. Hi, Naidin. And Sanjita Ahmed Christie, who are joining us, as I said, in the evening. From Dhaka. So Dr. Nahara is the Assistant Director of the Center of Excellence for Health Systems and Universal Health Coverage at BRAC University. She has a very, very wide range of expertise on a wide range of public health topics, has conducted research on topics including health systems, the health workforce, health equity, marginalized populations, adolescent health. I won't go through every topic, but suffice to say she's a very, very experienced and senior scholar. She will be joined by Sanjita Ahmed Srishti, who's a senior research assistant, also at BRAC, who has studied pharmacy and is currently also pursuing a PhD. And I hope Sanjita can see you also on the screen. I'm not sure. Wait, there you go. I need to turn my mic. So without further ado, let me give the floor to our two colleagues from BRAC, and then their presentation will be followed by Mr. Rahman Khan.
Thank you, Suri and Marsula. Good evening and happy Ramadan from Dhaka. On behalf of the study team, Sanjita, my colleague, and I'll be sharing some of the highlights from the study that we have conducted on pharmaceutical research and development in Bangladesh, the ground realities and the prospect. And just to avoid any network issues from our end and to have a better audio quality, maybe just not use the video while making the presentation to avoid the poor network at our end. We hope that is okay. Sanjita will be actually assisting me in controlling the slides. So Sanjita, let's start. Can you share the screen, Sanjita?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we can go to the background slide directly. So we have conducted this study from the Center of Excellence from Health System and Universal Health Coverage. That is one of the center at BRAC School of Public Health in BRAC University. The next slide, Sanjita. You may know that Bangladesh actually is one of the early bird of developing drug policy, and thanks to our industry expert, which helped the development of the industry back in 1982. The sector actually has grown over the last few decades, and currently pharmaceutical industry is the second highest contributor to our national GDP, right after our ready-made garments industry. And at present, we have around 257 licensed registered pharmaceutical manufacturer. They're the allopathic manufacturer. And with this large number of manufacturers, the market is highly concentrated. But interestingly, the industry is polarized and it is dominated mostly by the top producer, who are making up approximately 2/3 of our pharma market. Our industry is able to meet 98% of the total medicinal requirement of our local market. And 80% of the drugs that our pharmaceutical industry are producing are generic drugs. Our leading companies, they have nearly all major GMP accreditations, like from US FDA, UK MHR, and they're exporting medicine to global market, including the UK, USA, and Europe. Bangladesh pharmaceutical sector, it enjoys the benefit of TRIPS exempted from the patent protection by WTO for an extended period until 2033. Next slide, Sanjita. As you know, that pharmaceutical innovation, it is actually important because it creates value to the society by making it possible to generate improvement in people's health. As Bangladesh is still enjoying the TRIPS waiver, being a LMIC country, it can bring any new formula developed by other countries. But what will happen when Bangladesh will graduate from being a LMIC to a developed country? Bangladesh will need to proactively prepare actually for the situation of post-TRIPS waiver. But being a billion-dollar industry, there is a very little evidence on this. And in this research, we wanted to explore and map the current research and development scenario in our pharmaceutical industry. We also wanted to identify the main actor, the purpose, fund flow, and outcome of public health relevant to our pharmaceutical research and development. We also wanted to analyze our current pharma business model that our industry is having, and wanted to understand how the approaches to technological innovation may facilitate the purpose of research and development in the industry. Next slide. So in our research, we have used some operational definitions that we would like to share with you. For example, by research and development, we mean development of new molecule or new chemical entity. And by business model, we mean the way research and development is financed, organized, facilitated, regulated, and governed. And by pharmaceutical research and development as global public good, we mean that the product first must be generated and then it must be widely available and accessible to people. And by product development, we mean renewing of existing product or formula. Next slide. So we conducted a scoping review and a qualitative study for this research. And for the scoping review, we developed a protocol specifying the objective and inclusion-exclusion criteria. We use 4 search engines that included PubMed, Scopus, Research for Life, and also we use Google Scholar for peer-reviewed publication and Google for the gray material. We visited the website of relevant institutions and organizations for documents and report. And we followed the PRISMA approach to select and report the studies. We conducted key informant interviews to have a comprehensive understanding of our pharmaceutical R&D. And we categorize our respondent into 3 groups. First one are the implementer. The research and development personnel from the pharmaceutical industry itself. Second group was the financer, and in Bangladesh, those who are the decision maker for financing the pharmaceutical R&D, they were in this financer group. Third group was the facilitator, and it was a broader group which included the researcher, academician, and also regulatory bodies, civil society, and development partners. And we did a thematic analysis to present our findings. Next slide. Okay, now very briefly, I'll try to share some of the key findings from our scoping review and key informant interviews. Our review finding shows that the TRIPS comfort zone has produced a kind of vulnerability related to investment in R&D in our industry. There are still not enough innovative activities by most of the pharmaceutical companies. Studies reported the relationship of R&D investment and farm performance, and we found that different studies have reported that investors of Bangladesh do not consider the R&D expenditure to be a theater of innovation. And almost all other implementers that we interviewed, they mentioned that they do not have any innovative product or new chemical entity. However, it is not to say that we do not have any pharmaceutical R&D activities at all. Though our industry initially focused on formulation manufacturing, but recently many of the top companies are actually now actively working on producing the API, which is a step towards R&D in our industry. For example, one of the companies, they mentioned that they're working on rare disease and developing novel molecule, also develop COVID vaccine during the pandemic. But most of the companies actually, they're patenting their drugs outside Bangladesh, for example, in Europe, Australia, and India, because we do not have any updated patent law. And there are many cutting edge research are going on by academic researchers, for example, in Ayurvedic, in herbal medicine, neurology, pharmacology. But due to lack of collaboration between the academic and the industry, in many cases, the research they are doing, it's not getting scaled up. Next slide. Our findings also shows that around 80% of our pharmaceutical companies, they actually had below average level of innovation. So we wanted to understand what is the key focus of our industry. And according to the findings, the industry itself actually it's mainly a formulation industry. Besides generating substantial revenue, their prime goal is to provide patients with accessible generic medicine and meeting the consumer or the market demand. But not necessarily they are prioritizing the local disease for production of medicine in the country. And they also lack a vision for research. Priority is mostly given to the products that generate the highest revenue. And companies they're actively exporting their products to other countries because there is a great demand due to the low price, and also because the companies are able to meet the international regulatory requirements. There is a positive development that the large companies are also they are producing new drugs like antiviral, anti-cancer drugs. Next slide. So we wanted to identify who are the key actors of our pharmaceutical research and development. And there are two main governing bodies of Bangladesh drug and pharmacy sector, who are the DGDA, that is the Director General of Drug Administration, and Pharmacy Council of Bangladesh, PCB. DGDA is the government regulatory body under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, and they're responsible for all activities related to pharmaceuticals. And PCB is actually a semi-government body. They're mainly responsible for controlling the pharmacy practice. Our in-house investors are mainly the high authority within the companies who are responsible for allocating fund for the R&D activities, and they're mainly the owner of the companies. Our marketing department are those who run the market research and select drug and work on it. We have research and development department. They, based on the market research, they start the pilot batch study. And apart from these pharmaceutical stakeholders, there are other institutions who are promoting and conducting research and development. For example, institutions like ICDDRB, Bangladesh Medical Research Council. We have our National Institute of Epidemiology, that is IDCR, then the Institute of Public Health, and we also have our National Institutes of specific diseases like Cancer Research Institutes who are conducting research. The next slide. Okay, so let's take a quick look into our R&D funding scenario. According to the findings, our pharmaceutical sector actually receives no funding from the external sources for their research and development, and they're mostly self-funded. There is no direct involvement of government or private or non-government sector for financing the pharmaceutical R&D. Most of the researchers, they're affiliated with universities and conduct research utilizing 3 different sources of funding, which includes the government fund, individual fund, and fund from outside sources. Of these 3 sources, most of them rely on outside sources, for example, foreign fund from like National Institute of Health, NIH, and also from World Bank, Commonwealth, etc. Researchers from university and medical college, they receive funding from different government ministries, like from Ministry of Science and Technology, Ministry of Education, also receive funding from University Grant Commission. And it was also reported that government in recent time through Ministry of Health and Family Welfare have allocated fund for health research. So this slide, the next one, yeah. This slide actually shows the current business model of Bangladesh pharmaceutical industry. In this model, mainly based on market research, generic products are selected for production after a profit and loss analysis. Then the product pricing is done, and it has to be approved by DGDA. And then monthly to yearly forecast is made. Based on this data, the research and development department, they start producing the pilot batch, and after successful piloting, the budget for pre-launch activities are usually allocated. In this model, importing API is considered less expensive than producing them itself, actually. This results in fair market competition for supplying affordable medicine. Next slide. The perspective of a new business model is to compensate the innovator with fund from external sources in exchange for the knowledge they generated. And our respondent had actually varied opinion about this new business model concept. Some of the respondents, they believe that it is feasible and possible to have this concept that will have potential to increase availability of medicine across a different region. But others believe that if there is no patent policy, researchers will lose their interest and they won't be able, there will not be actually any competition, and there might be chance of misuse as well. Next slide. So our findings reveal that many challenges are hindering actually the path to effective research and development in pharmaceutical industry in the country. The current business model, though it is generating substantial profit while offering affordable medicine to people, and it is contributing significantly to our national economy, but this model is actually vulnerable to sustainability. Due to market competitiveness, the industry is actually facing a lot of companies had to invest a substantial amount of their resource in the promotion of medicine instead of investing it in research and development. Then there's an issue of not having a bioequivalence study within the country and weak capacity of a biotechnology lab. These are actually essential for any research and development operation. And this lack of capacity is a major concern. And there are also no accredited contract research organizations for conducting these studies. Many of the companies, they are contacting the CROs outside the country who are accredited. Lack of updated policy for current pharmaceutical research and development system, and the inadequate investment in this area was a major and common concern. Lack of collaboration that I already mentioned between the pharmaceutical industry and academia was another common concern, because of which the research in many cases actually they cannot be scaled up. Moreover, the reluctance of our local industry to invest in R&D because it requires a substantial investment without any guaranteed success. So our local pharmaceutical companies, they are unwilling and are actually not ready for any long-term investment, keeping the future strategic interest in their focus. Next slide. So our stakeholder, they made some suggestions regarding the priority actions. The stakeholders stress having appropriate policies, updated policies that can support our research and development and that can maximize the benefit of TRIPS flexibility. Also policy support to build the local intellectual property capabilities and infrastructure skill development to upgrade the laboratory environment. Our stakeholder also suggests that both government and non-government agencies should have more active role in restructuring the pharmaceutical infrastructure and developing skilled human resource for with technical expertise for the ability to conduct research and development was also recommended. And obviously they recommend about the cooperation and collaboration between different government, non-government actor, academic and industry collaboration beside the public-private collaboration. And this was also emphasized. From the next slide, Sanjida will be presenting some of the key findings from our database research. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nahitunapa. Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. So I will be sharing the findings from the database research. So as the qualitative findings have given us a snapshot of the current scenario of the pharmaceutical research and development in Bangladesh. And throughout the findings, the limitation of funding and collaboration came up most frequently. Although our funding is very limited, but the question arises that what is the amount and where this amount of funding is being invested on? Who are the conductors and sponsors for those research? So to explore more, 3 different database portals were analyzed. These are GFinder, clinicaltrials.gov registry, WHO, ICTRP. Starting with GFinder, which is Global Funding of Innovation for Neglected Diseases, which is a survey-based tool that collects and analyzes data on global investment in research and development for neglected diseases. So this portal has been used to track the amount of funding for neglected and emerging infectious diseases in Bangladesh. Secondly, in the clinicaltrials.gov registry, which is a publicly accessible database that provides information on clinical trials for a wide range of diseases and conditions, and it is maintained by NIH. And another registry was WHO ICTRP, which is another global platform for the registration and disclosure of clinical trials. So both of these registries were explored to analyze the current clinical trial situation in Bangladesh. So here is the findings from the GFinder analysis, which shows this table shows the total investment in different R&D stages in Bangladesh following the year 2007 to 2020. And through this analysis, one of the observations that came up total investment in R&D got increased over the period of time from the year 2007 to 2020. And if we talk about 2020, we can see that the investment in basic research is higher, but there is little to no investment in the discovery and preclinical stages and the clinical field development stage. And that finding is actually complements our qualitative result that we are not actually getting enough resources towards the preclinical phase, as Bangladesh have a lot of challenges in this stage because of having not a proper infrastructure for conducting preclinical trials in the R&D. The next, as we know, Bangladesh is receiving grants or funds from different organizations. So to explore more details where we found that who are the top funders for Bangladesh. These are the US NIH, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Wellcome Trust, and other organizations, which are mostly international. Here, this table shows that the total investment in neglected and emerging infectious disease, which is $51 million in Bangladesh. And we can see that the highest amount of investment is on cholera, which is 16 million due to high prevalence of this disease in Bangladesh. And here is the scenario for the investment in different diseases over the years in Bangladesh. And we can see that the focus of interest in investment is changing over the years. If we compare in 2007, the portion of funding were invested in neglected diseases and other multiple trial diseases, but in 2020, the area of interest is shifted to the basic research, typhoid, tuberculosis, and other sexual and reproductive conditions. And here are the findings that are from the clinicaltrials.gov registry. And as of last year, July 2022, we retrieved in total 500 clinical trials data, and we have found 336 interventional studies, 30 observational studies, and 134 unspecified studies. And from the interventional studies, the studies were in different phases, and in total 76.5% of phases were mentioned, and 23.5% were unspecified in this registry. As for this clinical trial studies in our country, different national government and national non-government organizations are conducting these studies. And we analyzed that who are those organizations. And we have found that different research organizations or universities are conducting these clinical trials. And among those, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujib Medical University is conducting the highest number of clinical trials from the national government organization, which is 18.2%. And among the national non-government organization, the research organization ICDDRB is conducting in total 175 clinical trials, which is 35% among the total clinical trial studies. So we can see that among these organizations, there are no association of the pharmaceutical industries for conducting these clinical trials, which is another important observation that we got from this analysis. And this is the clinical trial by phase from 1990 to 2020, which is done by Geneva Graduate Institute. And by looking at the distribution by phase for the entire period in this registry, we can observe that there are clinical trials in phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. But only 3.64% of the clinical trials were registered as phase 0 and phase 1. And we can say that the initial phase after innovation is being conducting elsewhere or in the foreign countries, and we are only working for the rest of the clinical, rest of the phases of the clinical trials in Bangladesh. So to conclude, The involvement of the relevant stakeholders, including government, in pharmaceutical R&D is limited in Bangladesh, and it is coupled with a lack of significant industry-academia collaboration, which eventually resulted in the focus of pharmaceutical industry in product development only, and making us unprepared for the post-TRIPS era. And to tackle this, we have some recommendations that the industry, government, research community need to be ready for the post-TRIPS era, and for facilitating R&D regulatory guidelines need to be developed and updated. And instead of short-term revenue generation, the industry should focus on the future sustainability, and universities and research organizations should receive more resources for generating necessary evidence. And the investment on for improving infrastructure and human resources should be done. Also, the collaboration between the public, private, industry, academia, and other relevant sectors should be established to tackle this problem. As the TRIPS waiver is going to be over very soon, so Bangladesh needs to start planning for it from today. By this, I am ending our presentation. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Sanjita. I'm going to invite Mr. Kamruzan to please, Kamruzan, excuse me, please come and take a seat. And microphone, we're very much forward to hearing your thoughts on the report and the R&D system in Bangladesh. Mr. Kamruzan is a counselor at the Permanent Mission of Bangladesh to the United Nations here. He's been with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs since 2008, has been based in Sydney, in New Delhi, in Stockholm, and has a wide range of expertise in economic affairs and multilateral. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Professor. It is a big honor to be here at the Graduate Institute to speak on this very important topic. As you are welcome to the geographical instrument, certainly this topic is just more relevant than others. Because of my association practicality in this negotiation in compared to the academic instrument, I think it will be going to speak on this linking research carried out by our researchers from the capital. At the outset, I would like to congratulate our research team from the capital. They have actually exploited on the facts on the ground, I should say. So when I was looking at the report and found that they have come up with a number of challenges prevailing in the sector. So a few of them actually drew my attention. First is low investment. Second, industry academia collaboration. Third, self-funding initiatives in the sector. And fourth, preparation for the post-TRIPS era. So if we build around these four things, I think they have been very pragmatic to the ground realities that we see in our country. These are the challenges actually they have come up with a set of recommendations. I was going through the recommendations. I see around 50% of them are speaking about normative measures. I think that is just to be more relevant in the current context of the instrument we are discussing in WHO platform. On the applicability of these normative measures in the developing country like Bangladesh, I would like to put a short comment that Bangladesh pharma industry grew taking the opportunity of flexibilities in the 1980s and 1990s. So that was the beginning ground. And with the passage of time, we see now it has reached to a height of $3.3 billion industry in the global market, and it has an export figure of around $200 million. It is a matter of pride for us if I say that the report has also pointed out that these producers from this manufacturing base are providing support to our country by around 97%, and only 3% are from the import. And for this, actually, the credit goes to the TRIPS flexibilities that we are still enjoying, and it will remain in force till 2033. They have been very mature, actually, to shed light on these normal measures that we currently have in our policy spectrum. These are the development in the global domain. Certainly, the suggestions speak about that we need to address the policy and legal issues to be sustainable in production and to address the future. Some challenges in the report should be specifically pointed out that our industries are yet to focus more on producers for the local diseases that are not being factored. It is really a matter of great importance that we need to come up with these things. While shedding light on those of the reports, if we try to draw a nexus how this transformation from a proper legal regime on TRIPS-related matters, patent-related matters would be required with the passage of time. But as we are still enjoying the flexibilities, that issues have to be seen in future. Probably we have to prepare much better for circumvent, for avoiding any kind of falling down from the current propensity of development. Now, if we look at the global scenario that we are debating currently in WHO, the Professor Suri is very well aware, and we see very often IHR amendment discussions. So there are two treaties actually, that is Pandemic Treaty and IHR amendment, and we are discussing agreements that should say with a sharp contrast between the developed and developing countries, and R&D issues dominate the scene. So while TRIPS measures are crucially important to encourage the researchers, at the same time it would be important to see how the developing country entrepreneurs could be encouraged under the flexibilities of TRIPS provisions. In my country, I see if there wouldn't have been this kind of TRIPS flexibility, we would not be able to address the health challenges that we had. Probably among the LDCs, Bangladesh is the only country that has been very successful in addressing the health issue, even during the current COVID-19 pandemic. So there should be opportunity for the future, and I think there should be scope in the research of those who are going to work on this. That is how the transition could be done without compromising the current pace of development. Otherwise, it will be a big setback. But it will be important that this developing country manufacturers should be given the opportunity to enjoy this flexibility. Otherwise, we cannot fully rely on the manufacturing bases in certain coordinates of the world, because during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have clearly seen that we have not been able to respond up to the mark, because still now, in some parts of the world, less than 50% of the people are not vaccinated. And that is a matter of failure for the global community, I should say. And surrounding that, we know about vaccine hesitancy, vaccine overpricing of vaccines, and availability and the matter of availability of vaccines are still a matter of great concern for the local community. So for the researchers, as a developing country diplomat working in WHO, bring us to more focus about the transitional matters, how better the developing countries in future would be able to cope up with the situation. I think that would be very much important. Otherwise, the success we have achieved in the health sector will fade out very soon. So with this, I would like to.
Thank you very much for helping us to link indeed some of this research with the ongoing debates here in Geneva. I think that's a perspective that's too often missing, certainly from the academic sphere. What I'd love to do now, given the time we're running a few minutes behind, is to turn directly to our presentations from Colombia, followed by a comment, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A, both for those of you who are online and those of you who are in the room. This has become very sensitive. Before we wrap up at 4:30. So let me invite now Professor Tatiana. Tatiana, are you here with us?
Yes.
Great. Yes, wonderful.
Yes, behind you.
She's an associate professor of sociology at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota. She earned her PhD from Brown University. She has been working on issues of pharmaceutical policy for many years. Has also been an advisor to the health minister of Colombia, as well as to a number of intergovernmental organizations, and led the Andes team in this collaboration. So we'll hear Tatiana first from you, and then turn to Liliana Tenorio.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Hello all. I would love to see you in person, but this will have to do. I'm going to share my presentation and share some of the findings of this amazing collaboration that we have conducted over the past few years with the teams in Geneva and Bangladesh. Let me find the presentation. Okay. Can you see it, Suri?
We see you. We see your slides.
Perfect. Let me see. And yeah, okay. So the title we have decided to give this report, I think, wraps or sums what we found in this research, and is basically that the R&D and innovation ecosystem in Colombia is rich. It has many actors and players, has been developing over the past few years, but it lacks or it needs more coordination among these actors, and there are some interesting developments in that path or that vein of actors that have appeared to try to do those coordination efforts. So I'm gonna basically walk you through the report with a brief introduction, the methodology that we use, the databases we consulted, and the interviews, our main findings, and a little bit of a discussion or a conclusion. So in terms of introduction or context, the Colombian R&D ecosystem. So first of all, I think the main framing for this project also is that there are some capacities that have been built in developing countries, Colombia not being the exception, but definitely the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted that some of those or all of those capacities were not sufficient in many cases to guarantee the health sovereignty in many developing countries. So with that frame, we try to look at where were the main challenges also with the lens of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm going to show you a little bit more of this, but the main finding in terms of context in Colombia is basically a development finding or a development strategy finding. And that is that Colombia has opted historically to with a development strategy that basically in terms of state intervention has privileged a loose competitiveness public policy or approach rather than an express and direct industrial policy in contrast with other Latin American countries such as Brazil, for example, where the state basically has a role of coordinating actors, private actors, and set the stage so that they can develop further. The other element that is important to know about Colombian context is that Colombia has signed several free trade agreements with the US, with the EU, with Korea, with many other countries, and many of those FTAs have intellectual property provisions that limit some of the industrial policy strategies that the country can develop, but also gives a direct hint to researchers on how to approach an innovation model. And the last context element that you would need to know is that Colombia also has an important domestic production capacity. Similarly to Bangladesh, Colombia has mostly developed that capacity to produce generics, both branded and unbranded generics. And that production capacity could develop further, but the development of R&D activities and other types of products, for example, biologic, is limited to this date. So this is a graph that I won't explain fully, but these are kind of all the regulatory moments in different moments of the research process, both clinical trials, the research scouting and licensing on your left. So the different moments of an R&D system, and in red. In black, you see the general policies that the country has created to give a orientation on how these different stages need to work. And on red, the specific norms for healthcare innovation. So there are rules for R&D in any area, but then there are some rules that are specific to healthcare innovation. And what I highlighted on the left is that unlike any other R&D area in the country, for healthcare R&D development, there is a specific public fund that is called actually the Fund for Health Research, with that only funds that sets some, let's say, money apart just to finance health R&D. And that is something that is exceptional in the R&D ecosystem in general, because there is no other type of product or type of basic research that has a specific public fund. How is this fund? How does this fund work? It takes 7% of the taxes that are collected from gambling and other activities of that sort, and those funds or those taxes are collected locally, domestically, locally, regionally in all the country, and that all those taxes go to a centralized fund, and 7% of all the taxes collected every year go to fund health research. It's kind of a rare figure because there's no direct relationship between gambling and healthcare, but still is an important source of public funding for health research. So what did we do in this research? We did three things. The first one is a literature and policy review. We basically looked at the history of R&D policy and in the country, and also did a literature review on the many different academic papers that talk about the effectiveness of R&D in the country. Then we conducted interviews, many, very few interviews, but to a specific type of actor that we have identified over the years working on R&D on R&D policy in the country as very interesting actors. They are not exactly what both the global and the Bangladesh study call facilitators. They are facilitators, but they go a little bit further, or a little bit, they do more activities, R&D activities. So they're not only facilitators amongst actors, they're also facilitators and conduct some stages of R&D. So it's a rare facilitator. We call them innovation accelerators because they call themselves innovation accelerators. They are both public and private organizations. And they basically are trying to bridge, again, with the title of the presentation, they are trying to bridge researchers and production. That is the main challenge in the Colombian R&D ecosystem, that there is a lack of connection between the production side of things and the basic and applied R&D. So they identify the researchers, the innovators that are doing interesting things or promising things, and they identify funding or companies that would be maybe interested in further developing the products of that research. And then the other thing that we did is review the R&D databases. We did basically, we searched two main type of sources. One that was very difficult to work with is the Ministry of Science and Technology database. Is complicated to navigate because the categories are not clearly stated, so the data cleaning was difficult, but that gives us a general idea of what the public R&D looks like, what are they investing in, what type of diseases are they concentrated in, and how much and what type of research are they funding. Whereas whether they are funding basic research or applied research. And then we looked at the clinical trial, and for the R&D of the domestic and international, internationally funding R&D, we also looked at other databases to try to complement what we found in the Ministry of Science database. And then we looked, similarly to what the Bangladesh team did, we looked at the clinical trials databases. So let me give you some of the results. So from the literature and policy review, this is kind of a timeline of how the science and technology policies have developed. And basically the main finding is that something that I already told you, that the R&D policy is understood as living in this ecosystem that we could call a competitiveness approach of how R&D should work with production and other development sectors. But it has developed quite interestingly with a clear increase in funding, but also a clear institutional development, because we used to have an R&D agency. It was an agency and not a ministry. We now have a science and technology ministry. So the importance of the science and technology in the country institutionally has increased interestingly over the years. However, although we have increased our interest in science and technology, there's still this gap between science and technology and R&D funding and so on with the production side of things. There is production capacity. Probably there could be more development of clinical trials, domestic clinical trials of many of the findings that are being developed by the universities and researchers, but that gap has not been clearly breached. And the other big challenge is that in terms of public policy, there's also a lack of coordination between the many different regulatory agencies and ministries that are involved in the development of products from R&D, right? So there is a limited coordination between the Ministry of Science and Technology, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, the Ministry of Health, and the main regulatory agency, our FDA, that is called INVIMA. So there's lack of also public coordination among different agencies, which limits the capacity of R&D to actually become products. And there's still a lack of more clear definition of the science and technology policies. There has been a lot of development, but many researchers complain that there's from a previous research where we interviewed many researchers, they complain that there's still a lot of policy development that can be done in this sector. So the main challenge is of actually accessing financial resources. So there's this kickoff funding for R&D from the public Ministry of Science and this fund that I've been talking about, but that funding is limited, and there's still it's difficult to gather enough funding for continuous research, especially, and for this bridge between R&D and production. So then I want to talk to you about these innovation accelerators. These are the main three innovation accelerators in the country. Interestingly, they are all located in Medellin. That is probably the city that has invested and created a more attractive environment for R&D. One is Ruta N, and Ruta N is a public, not national, but local innovation accelerator. And they basically identify interesting research that is being done by universities mostly, but not exclusively, and link them to industries that can take on that research, or they even sometimes provide the funding themselves so that this research can go into further stages. The second innovation accelerator is called Tech Innovation Group. This is interesting because it's a private initiative, completely private, and basically their motto or their mission is to impact health, and they have an explicit focus on what are the health needs, or what they consider to be the most important health needs in Colombia. They don't only focus on healthcare technologies, they also do animal and environmental innovation. And they are the ones, so Ruta N works more as a facilitator in the explicit terms that we've been talking now about, just bridging and providing sometimes funding. Tech Innovation Group goes a little bit further. They develop, sometimes they get involved in the R&D process, both by conducting initial clinical trials, and sometimes even a little bit before that stage in preclinical trials research. And then there's the PECET that is public in the sense that is financed through the Universidad de Antioquia, so one of the biggest and most important universities in the country. And they started as researchers, and they faced this experience is really interesting because they faced the challenges that I've been talking about and decided to create an alternative or a solution for the challenges of basic research in the country. So they do basically communicable diseases research, mostly dengue and leishmaniasis or leishmania. And they started with a model that, interestingly, from the perspective of intellectual property, with a traditional model of patenting their findings, and through the tech transfer office of the university, try to license then those findings. That didn't work, that strategy didn't work, and their patents were costly. They were not effective in actually further their production phase. So they created this kind of innovation accelerator for themselves, but also for other researchers that could be interested within that area of expertise, so still tropical diseases. So basically they themselves conduct that bridge with, so very important on all these three innovation accelerators, patents are not the main thing of any of them. They do different types of intellectual property. Ruta N is more formal and sometimes funds or finances some patent applications and so on. But in general, their approach to intellectual property is not orthodox. So for example, Tech Innovation Group uses mostly industrial secrets rather than patents to protect their innovation or the innovation that they select. Similarly, PECET has changed their strategy and they patent less, and instead they privilege finding partners to actually work on the production or the product development phase. So all three are a very, very rich, and also I would like to highlight that they develop themselves, right? There's no policy, centralized policy, national policy, that they are trying to solve an issue that many of them identified as the problem with innovation especially in this region in Antioquia, and decided to solve them themselves. So basically, I told you a lot of this already. But the finding
to about 5 minutes, so we have enough time for
yes,
comments and Q&A. Yes.
Perfect. So these are the main findings that I already told you about. So I'm gonna go to the R&D. So this is the basic R&D funding, the domestic R&D, and you can see that although we have this publicly funded this public fund that funds R&D in Colombia, most of that funding goes to applied research rather than basic research. These are the diseases where that funding concentrates, and is like both mostly in communicable diseases, but also on non-communicable diseases. We complemented all these findings are from the Colombian Ministry of Science database. Complementing that information, we looked at the Finder and Policy Cures, the international databases, to see what phases is the locally funded research concentrated in, and as you can see, many of that research is concentrated on discovery and preclinical phases, and not so much in other stages. In terms of the diseases where this funding is concentrated, we see a lot of research in dengue, and the research and you can see that this is the colors correspond to what type of research we are talking about, and dengue, malaria are the main areas where basic research is being conducted. And we also looked at how much researchers search for international R&D funding, and what type and who are the main funders. As you can see in the graph, the main funder for research in Colombia is the National Institute of Health, followed by the Canadian Institute of Health Research. And in international funding, the most funded research areas are mental health and mental education or training. So these are the main conclusions of looking at the R&D funding databases. Local funding is focused mostly on dengue, malaria, tuberculosis, and external funding is more focused on other diseases. Oh, this is just to show you, this is interesting because I was telling you that the main region where research and development is happening in the country is Antioquia, and you can see in the map how it increased the participation over the years. So I will conclude by talking to you a little bit about clinical trials. Our main finding with clinical trials is similar to what the global report finds in terms of a clear increase in clinical trials in Colombia, but a concentration on the phase 3 clinical trials. It has increased a lot, and Colombia has become the 5th country in the region with the most clinical trials. You can see here the increase is a sharp increase beginning in the 2000s. Of course, it fell a little bit in the 2020 because of the pandemic, but it is a consistent trend. In terms of what are these clinical trials about, is mostly phase 4, phase 3, rather than phase 1 research, although in certain areas such as cardiovascular diseases, we see an important participation of early phases of research. This is the total clinical trials that are conducted with national sponsors. We wanted to look at how much, whether national sponsors were important, or whether the pharmaceutical multinational companies were the main drivers of this tendency. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies are the main drivers, but there is some clinical trials that are conducted by local sponsors. Who are those local sponsors? Mostly academia and hospitals. Health institutions are actually hospitals, public hospitals and private. This is the comparison with the other Latin American countries, and you can see, of course, that Brazil is the biggest, has the biggest share in clinical trials in the region. But we also did this by per inhabitants, and when you do it per population, controlled by population, there's of course a different trend, and Chile becomes the country with the most clinical trials per in a number of people, rather than Brazil, that is the country that conducts more. So to conclude, we, I think, wanted to highlight in this report that the science and technology ecosystem in Colombia has developed interestingly, that we have increased R&D funding, we have increased clinical trials conducted, and not all of them are phase 3 and phase 4. There's some early phases of clinical trials, but we wanted to highlight mostly the actors that I talked too much about, that are these innovation accelerators, because one of the main challenges of the approach to development that I talked earlier is that coordinating different types of actors, different of public resources, different public institutions, is difficult. And these bridges or brokers emerge as an interesting type of actor that we think could be almost something that can be copied or could be of interest in other developing countries. So that's it, Suri. I hope I did less than the 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. In the interest of time, let me turn immediately to Juliana Tenorio. There you are. Wonderful. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Maria Juliana Tenorio Quintero is Minister Counselor with the Permanent Mission of Colombia to the UN here in Geneva. Currently Minister Counselor. She has a PhD in Public International Law as well as an LLM in International Law, and she has been working with the foreign ministries for 18 years. And again, we would like to ask you to comment on the study findings, and in particular, to help us understand the relevance of these findings for some of the ongoing policy debates. And it's very nice that I think your son is also joining us today. We don't quite hear you yet.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, I'm really sorry for my location and for my sound, because I'm actually not in Geneva and I wanted to be in Geneva. So please let me know if you can hear me.
Background noise.
No, I'm afraid.
No,
We
you don't
see
hear
you.
me at all.
Yeah.
I can hear you, but I hear you very far away.
Yeah, very, very low volume.
And lots of background noise.
Not yet.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, I just took away my headphones. I'm really sorry for my location. I apologize to Tatiana. I'm not in Geneva right now. And like I see, my son is right next to me. This is like the first time that my kids' holidays and some days off that I had coincide. So I'm away from Geneva. And I was very interested hearing your presentation, Tatiana, and all the work that you have done in Colombia and the research and development in Colombia. So thank you very much for the presentation. And as Professor Moon was saying, that I'm gonna build on your research to do some further reflections of what is going on in Geneva and how can academia help these processes that we're working on in Geneva, and especially in the World Health Organization. That is so much going on, and I really believe that these processes are very important, and this research are very important to help us, the governments and diplomats in Geneva, to move process forward. So first of all, it was very interesting hearing in this report about the different roles of different entities in R&D, especially not the public entities, of course, the governments, but also the interlinkage with the private sector and of course, the academia. So I think that it needs to be reflected not only at the national level, but also at the international level. And we are seeing this in there are two processes that I think everybody in the room and the Graduate Institute are familiar with. That's the negotiations on the Treaty on Pandemics, or that we call the INB process, and also the amendments to the HR. And we are like talking within governments, and the processes have been closed mainly because we're in the drafting procedures. Of course, non-state actors are also involved, but not within the drafting procedures. But we're forgetting a key actor, that is the private sector. So it's very hard to us as governments to work with many people around, because we need to find consensus in some different issues and very difficult ones. But we are aware that we need the private sector, because mainly the private sector are the ones who are leading research and development. So that's a good thing to bear in mind in these processes. So the other thing that I wanted to highlight is that access to technologies are a key factor for LMIC, so low and middle income countries, such as Colombia, especially to deal with emergencies and future pandemics. This is the only way that we can safeguard access to medical countermeasures in our countries like Colombia. So you find in the study the restrictions of access to technologies and the need to invest more in R&D. So I think that is key, especially since we don't lower that from the north to the south, the R&D. And that's, I think, one of the lessons that we learned from COVID-19. And the third thing that I wanted to highlight is that it's all about equity. So I think my colleague from Bangladesh will agree with me. These findings and the importance of these findings, not only for the IHR amendment process, but also to the INB, is that it is throughout what we do in WHO. It's equity. So and it's also not only for these two processes that I mentioned, but also to the process of reassessing the emergency response structure at the system at the WHO. So we're seeing how the emergency response program is going to be designed in the WHO, and we have 10 different proposals from the DJ, from Director General, and we're discussing this right now. But we need that. We need R&D, and we need R&D throughout the different countries. So because without access to technologies and proper investments in R&D, the low and middle income countries will be in a very difficult place to have the proper tools to fight against health emergencies or even future pandemics. Of course, and you also highlight that in the study, this need to be accompanied by the proper levels of funding. That's a very key important issue, but not only at the national level, but also at the international level. And of course, there's another, I think there is a three pillars in everything that we do. We also need the construction of the corresponding capacity building that can promote the use and further development of new technologies. So I really enjoy actually your presentation, and it was very it highlights the things that we need to do in Colombia, but I wanted to translate that into the international level and the things that we're doing in Geneva. So thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you very much to the Graduate Institute and Professor Monan. I don't see Marcela, but Marcela, who was the one who contacted me. And thank you very much for the opportunity. And again, apologies for my very poor location. Thanks.
Thank you so much for making the time while you're away to join us. We really appreciate it, and I know that's not an easy thing to organize. What I'd like to do in the few minutes we have left is to just make sure that we open the floor a little bit, have time to hear some reflections from those of you in the room, those of you online. If you'd like to share any comments or pose any questions to any of the research teams, we have about not too much time, maybe about 10 minutes before I'll offer just a couple of closing remarks, and then we'll wrap up the session for the day. Do we have some online? Thank you. Okay. So we have a comment from Brooke Baker, who says this is exciting evidence of increased public investment in LMICs, prioritizing unmet local needs. Are these approaches expanding open science collaboration and sharing of results? Are these new models focusing on access and the need to fund not only R&D but also manufacturing products to be market failures? Are there models of sharing technologies such as the mRNA Tech Transfer Hub? Is there a truly new R&D and access model developing? I think Marcella may have some comments on this, but let me turn first to our colleagues from Colombia and Bangladesh to see if any of you would like to respond to this question. I think it's also in the chat for those of you, yes, who've joined us online. While I give you a moment to see if you'd like to respond, let me just look across the room. Yes, go. Let's take one more question.
Especially from this research work on Bangladesh, I think it might be interesting to look at the new molecules introduced, the generic versions introduced by Bangladesh companies in the last 5 years or 10 years. To take an example, like on COVID, I think remdesivir, the first generic version in the world, is introduced by a Bangladesh company. Similarly, non-COVID famous one is hepatitis C medicine, sofosbuvir. The generic version came from globally. The first generic version came from Bangladesh. Similarly, many cancer medicines, like the CLIP family, CLIP. So these are the medicines which treat for metastatic HER2 breast cancer. The generic version is available in Bangladesh. So I think it's a good idea to compile the list. That's a kind of an innovation because you need some kind of innovative capacity to introduce these medicines. So I think it is interesting to put that list there. And second, I think we always look at international agreements. We always look at TRIPS agreement or free trade agreements. But I think another set of agreements we always know they are not agreements, but they work as the drug regulatory framework, which plays a very important role in innovation. So what we have been seeing is that over a period of time, the big companies use us IP and regulatory framework to manage the competition. And unfortunately, many developing countries are incorporating the regulatory framework in such a way which will have adverse implications on climbing up the innovation value chain. And lastly, not of course, so on all these clinical trial shows, large number of foreign sponsored trials are happening. But these are all done by basically CROs, right? And we can, on argument's sake, we can say that, okay, clinical trial, whether it happens or not, whether it's foreign or national, it's going to create some kind of infrastructure. But many times, that infrastructure does not exist in countries because it's only with the doctors they deal with, what you call the CROs, contract research organizations, and the medicine is given and the report is, we're not even compelled, it is directly go to the CRO. So not even there is a national infrastructure to even to collect data and process the data. So that's an issue actually. So that there is a need to go beyond this clinical trial data and to examine whether it really contributes to the innovation. Thanks.
Thanks very much for those comments. Let me just see if there's any other requests Or on the floor? Yes, one and then two. Okay, Vito on the back.
Thank you very much. So I'm Victor from the South Center. I just wanted to make the two remarks. First, to really congratulate the kind of information that has been provided today. It's extremely useful, not only because, as you mentioned, we don't have a single database, but then even this delineation, for instance, with respect to clinical trials and the countries' activities, I think it's very important. And I would also echo what our colleagues from Bangladesh and Colombia said, how useful this really is for the ongoing negotiations here in Geneva. So I just wanted to personally thank you very much for that. And in that sense, perhaps the second related comment is to really highlight how all the global south is really overcoming so many different barriers towards achieving innovation. And then perhaps generally, and particularly when we're talking about more conventional modes of innovation, there's always this trend to insist on regular incentives, such as intellectual property, as well as focusing on the big corporations and the big countries that do it. And then in a way, when we're using the same metrics to assess the quality of innovation in developing countries in the global south, perhaps we're really missing the point that to achieve certain things, you really need to do so much more. So I think in a way, this is all reflected as well in that research. Perhaps just one issue that I was curious about, and I understand it's not exactly part of, but it was referred to a few times, but then refers to how traditional medicine and innovation is part of that compilation of data. If we could distill it and turn it into something different, or if it would be under the bigger pack. And additionally, if that, I mean, we see a lot of talks, of course, for traditional medicine or traditional knowledge as a big source of innovation in Africa and Latin America and Asia and other areas as well. So just wondering if the data would also be reflecting that sort of aspiration, or if there's something that we could do about this as well. So, but that's just more a perspective thing. And thank you again.
Thanks very much.
Yes, did I get it right that there has never been a civil war in Colombia, there has never been a Rohingya health crisis in Bangladesh, there has never been a brain drain in India? Because maybe I have bad hearing, but I have not heard a word about the political context and the sharply changing and sometimes very brutally changing political context throughout the past 20 or 30 years in this country. And second one is a short remark. Many countries from the south could leapfrog in electronics, but it's not so simple with pharma. Sure, the pharma market is not quite the market, but could anyone comment why it doesn't work with pharma?
Great, thank you. Lots of directions for future research, I would say. Questions on the table. Let me first turn to perhaps our colleagues in Bangladesh to see if you'd like to respond to any of the questions that have been put on the table. Naitun or Sanjita or Veda?
Maybe I can answer the first question. Yeah, okay. Maybe I can jump into the first question. If you see from our slide, as the speaker was saying, that the traditional medicine can be given as aspiration for innovation. So if you see in our country, there are many cutting-edge researches done by academicians in phytochemistry, herbal and Ayurvedic medicines. So those things are not getting scaled up because of the lack of pharma-academia collaboration in our country. So definitely we have a very good scope of traditional medicines, because one of the traditional medicine we have in our country, which is marketed by one of the top pharmaceutical companies. And for that herbal medicine, there is a small collaboration between a university and that pharmaceuticals. So that is a very successful one. And we are all having that herbal medicine during cough and during cold, and that is very effective. But these things are not exported to abroad or other countries, and these are not marketed as much as the allopathic ones. So these things can be in our report, we emphasized on that a lot, that because our research is directed to that, so these things can be brought into the light. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Abeda. Tatiana, over to you.
Yeah, yes. So I will try to connect all the questions and give a brief comment on all of them. I would start with the political context, because I do think there's a changing political context in Latin America. And of course, in Colombia, there's for the first time, there's a government from the left in power, and that has definitely changed the environment, not only for science and technology, but for many other things. Saying that, and so in terms of the science and technology ecosystem, I do think this new government wants to change the way we have approached development and I would say export-led development to build, they have called them a reindustrialization strategy. That context is very important because in connecting to something that Maria Juliana said, in international arenas, I do think there must we should try to be more coordinated, because what we are seeing now in Latin America is that many countries are going for health sovereignty with the motto of health sovereignty. They're investing in production capacities, they're investing in basic research more, but there's lack of international coordination on those efforts, and that I think could hamper or could create duplicities across countries. And I think this may be important for the pandemics treaty, because we don't want to cannibalize across developing countries. I think we need a global effort and some coordination internationally. That connects also with the question of Professor Baker, because I don't see too much of sharing of R&D or sharing of knowledge or open science as I would like to. So there's a lot of investment or increasing investment in R&D, but still with the idea of protecting somehow, even though, as I told you, patents may not be the first thing to go to, also because they're expensive and they are difficult to sustain over time, but that's not being replaced by open science. It's being replaced by other forms of intellectual property protection. So again, that may also be relevant for the international arena and the treaty on pandemics. I think that's it. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Nigel, I thought I saw you wanted to come in earlier. We'll have comment from Nigel and then from Marcella and then Nigel, please. Maybe Nigel was not asking for the floor. No? I thought earlier. Okay.
She turned on her mic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add with Tatiana that in Bangladesh, actually, what we have seen that the expected technology transfer didn't happen, which was expected during this TRIPS transition period. And there were certain challenges and difficulties related to technology transfer. And for example, it is expensive indeed, the technology transfer. There are issues of tax and other things. And moreover, we didn't have actually the regulatory environment that would support the technology transfer. For example, our patent law that we still have, it is from our British period. So obviously that needs a to be updated to support this kind of technology transfer and encourage the building capacity of our own firms in terms of their technical capacity for innovation and also the regulatory capability. This has been actually one of the common findings that we have all through. And there was one comment regarding the CROs. Yes, in Bangladesh, most of the CROs who were working, they're mainly doing the the disease and drug evaluations instead of doing the clinical trial of new molecule because of lack of capacity and also because of that issues of accreditation. Yeah, and that's what I wanted to add and supplement with Tatiana. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've had a request.
Yeah. Do I need mic or I can? Currently, we're having revision of the IHR amendment and discussing another new treaty. So this discussion actually demonstrates that we need to have a broader change in the global legal regime. And it is based on the experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have to understand that current TRIPS issues need to be flexible. Otherwise, we won't be able to face the future challenges in a better way. So if you follow the current discussion on both instruments, you will see how the developing countries are speaking about TRIPS flexibilities. I think Bangladesh is the best example, which has been able to respond in the best way to the current COVID-19 pandemic because of its small manufacturing base. If this facility is given to other developing countries or at least some developing countries, I think some of the countries will come up to have their own manufacturing base. So in this area, I think the civil society and academia should work. How we can create enablers for the industries, for the R&Ds of the developing countries. Otherwise, if we have concentration of manufacturing base in some coordinates of the world, we will never see in future strong measures, strong supplies that we felt during the COVID-19 pandemic. With the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm about to unmute me on my hat in terms of closing the event on time. So I'm going to ask Marcella, do you have any closing responses to the questions?
I just wanted to I think just two points that were raised here. I don't really but on the point of traditional medicine, we identified some studies that show how the research from more Western product development builds a lot from traditional medicine, especially in China, India, some great plant-based research in Brazil, and all of that also translates into product developments that follows, let's say, the more regulatory standards of the clinical trials. So there are some studies on that, and it was also raised by some of our interviewees that you can refer to in the full research report showing that how that pathway is followed by different countries. On the question about more alternative models, we have also identified some studies that shows some open databases for sharing of data that can lead to further product development. One in Brazil also using information from biodiversity, from Great Lakes, that open data source directed to further product developments. There were other examples of sharing platforms in Latin America, led by the NDI for Chagas disease, if I'm not mistaken. So there are a few examples here and there of more alternative models, if we can say, that were also identified in the interviews and in the literature. And hopefully, as we mentioned, we are going to give more information about those into the business model project reports that's coming at the end of the year or early next year. The question on the clinical trials, versus CROs just providing the companies that just provide like services for innovation coming from outside. That's something that we were not able to dig so deep into our research, but we did see in the literature and also in the analysis that was done by both the teams in Bangladesh and Colombia, that there are rising involvement of local actors in innovation. They were able to do this classification of international versus national actors that are involved. That we can see that there is a growing number of actually local actors involved, as we said, in particularly the early phases that indicates more involvement and more indigenous innovation actually happening and coming from these countries. So hopefully we are going to see much more of that in the upcoming years. So that's all of the questions that I got from the room. So to you for closing the event.
Thank you so much for those precise responses to the questions put on the table. I think if we begin by thinking about what in the popular imagination, where does pharmaceutical innovation come from? We think of perhaps a multinational firm based in a high-income country, a Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, for example. To me, one of the most interesting findings of this research is that that picture is really shifting, and that pretty much all of the indicators we looked at across low and middle income countries show an upward trend. And I think that's a very pronounced shift from where the world was 10 or 20 years ago. But of course, once we begin looking more in detail, we see there's a huge diversity of national innovation systems. We see there are lots of challenges, and still today, most of the R&D financing activity, et cetera, does remain in high-income countries. That's what the data shows. But I do think that the world looks very different from even what many experts in the field have recognized in terms of how much innovative activity and capacity is happening in low and middle income countries, and this has a potential to change some of the policy debates here in Geneva. If there's one thing that I think we have not seen enough of, it's linking some of these quite national level efforts together to think about what are the needs for international cooperation, for international legal frameworks, for cooperation in terms of sharing data, innovative capacities, et cetera, across countries, whether within regions or beyond, and that we remain very much in this kind of national mindset when we think about strengthening R&D systems or capacity. But I would like to highlight that from the literature, many people pointed only to the large middle-income countries, let's say to the BRICS countries, say, all this innovation is happening in China and India and Brazil and South Africa, and this is true. But to me, one of the interesting findings when you think about that last table of 16 countries that led on a number of innovators, it's actually quite a surprising and wider range of countries, including some less usual suspects, I would say, where there's quite a lot happening. And I think the more we look at the data, the more we'll find, interesting developments and patterns, including, I hope, more alternative innovation models in the future. But as every researcher says, when they close a research project, there's lots of need for future research. There's many unanswered questions. There's many things we did not have the time or means to ask or answer. But I hope these findings are of interest and use to you. We hope that some of you will continue to carry out some of the research to answer some of these questions. And let me end by just thanking a few colleagues. First, I'd like to thank our colleagues at BRAC University, at Universidad de los Andes, for the very productive collaboration over the last 2 years, to our funder, the Open Society Universities Network, to all of you who've stayed in this room a bit longer than I promised, and certainly those of you online, especially those who stayed up late and gotten up very early. To our research teams for all of the hard work that has gone into these products, and to our colleagues at the Global Health Center, Bettina and Alessia, and there's Ellen in the back of the room. You can just wave, without whom certainly this event would not have gone as smoothly as it has. So thank you, everyone. I'd like to invite those of you here in person to join us for a reception outside where we can continue the conversation. Thank you very much.